Hello, and welcome to another week of the Story Darks podcast. I'm your co-host, Mike.
And I'm your co-host, Alex.
And today we are continuing Death Month with our discussion of The Many Deaths of Laila Starr by Ram V and Filipe Andrade.
Yes.
Is it Ram or Ram? It's Ram.
Ram V, I believe how he pronounces it.
At comic shops, you hear everything.
Yeah. And this is one case where I can say I've talked to the man in person, and he says it is Ram V. So I got to meet him in Orlando a couple years ago. Very, very cool. I met him in Orlando in early summer, I think, and it's Florida in early summer. It was very hot and very humid, and Ram made some comment of the fact of like, yeah, it kind of feels like home being India. I was like, yeah, I'm used to this. This is normal, because it was hot and humid and muggy up there. But yeah, very, 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 very cool. And I think we mentioned in the Zero episode 2 weeks ago that of all the creators we're going to be talking about through Death Month, writers, artists, and whatnot, he's probably the biggest name going right now because he has had books at Marvel. He has multiple books going on right now at DC. So he's kind of one of the bigger names. But when he does kind of jump out into the indie space, he can be all over the map. Like I said, Laila Starr Here is on Boom. His follow-up series with Filipe Andrade, Rare Flavors, is on Boom. I think he's had a book recently finished up, Day Runner. I think that was a Dark Horse book. So he excuse me. He can be kind of, I guess it all depends on where the best deal is. But in terms of kind of biggest names right now, current creators, I think Ram is probably the biggest one we're going to be covering this month.
Yeah, well, and he had what was supposed to be a really great run on Detective Comics.
Yeah, very cool.
I saw cool covers, but I didn't really read it. So I was like, it was very, very cool. That just wrapped up. I don't know how many issues total it ran. Tom Keller just took over like 3 months ago.
Yeah. No, they as a recording right now, DC just kind of did a soft reset of all their titles pretty much. They switched up creative teams for the most part on all their major books, on all their books actually, and so a lot of runs came to close. You mentioned Tom Taylor; he wrapped up his run on Nightwing. He's over on Detective now. Ram finished up on Detective. He just started a New Gods book, as we mentioned. So yeah, he's all over the place at DC. But it's cool when he jumps out and gets to tell a more personal story.
It's something that pulls from what I assume is well-known cultural background, but not to me.
Yeah, and not to a Western audience, not to an American audience.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like if someone wrote an American story about Johnny Appleseed and Paul Bunyan or something as characters in it or something, it's like that's a deeply American story.
Yeah.
And requires some cultural import. That being said, I think he does this very gracefully. I didn't pause and Google stuff. And so I have two little meta notes on the series as a whole before we start diving into the content.
Sure.
The first is this, and this could just be my exposure, but this is the subject matter, length, everything about this seems very Boom adjacent. It seems very Image Comics to me. Like, I think of this as an Image book, even though I know it's a Boom. And if you told me the premise, told me it's 6 issues, I'd be like, oh, that sounds like a perfect Image Comics book. But I think it just shows how much Boom has grown as a studio in the last 10 years and how they've really branched out. And you got to have some kind of name to publish a book like this. It's like, hear me out. We're going to follow the Goddess of Death for 6 issues, the end.
Five
issues. Right. Only 5 issues. And that's the second note I have, is that I think it's the absolute perfect use of the 5-issue format.
I think going on that meta publishing idea, I think it's like perfectly paced. And I think a lot of other writers, or perhaps this is more editors in the comic realm, would have taken this idea and said like, oh, this is really, really great. But let's slow walk this a little bit. Let's give her more day in the life adventures in between. Like the 5 meetups she has with him
would still be the 5 key issues, but
Mhm.
you put a bunch of interstitial stuff in between, and she kind
What
of lives
is
a life in all
what
of
is
those
death doing
years.
on the other days? Yeah,
Right. And
yeah,
it's like,
yeah.
gosh, that would be excruciating. In the
Or
hands of Rom, I think it'd be very well done. It could be interesting. And that's like, to me, that's the type of thing that happens when they like adapt a book into a TV show or something, and they just pad the runtime with a bunch of garbage.
yeah, you got to fill the time. So it's interesting you went that route. The way that I was thinking about it was if they were expanding the series is anytime you have those cuts at the end where it's like 8 days, 8 years, 16 years, whatever it was, whatever those time jumps were. I think the temptation would be not so much do what you said, which was, oh, just what's Death slash Layla doing on the times when she's not having these encounters, but instead having her have more frequent encounters. Think that I felt
Oh,
that would be a
yeah.
temptation where it's like every couple of years they're checking in, and that I think would get tedious. But the idea that we jump from the day he's born to a child to a teenager on the brink of adulthood to as an adult to someone at the end of his life now, so
Right.
we're hitting at all these moments, these kind of big transitional moments, obviously. Excuse me, transitional moments for in Dolls in his actual life, what is it, the that first funeral, the worker on his farm dies, and then his best friend dies, his wife dies, then he's dying, you know
Right. It's literally and figuratively all his encounters with death.
Exactly, yes, yeah, and
I mean,
so
which is like anytime you have a character named Death,
yeah,
the wordplay kind of writes itself.
it
But
does, it does.
I think it's used very, very well and also pretty well restrained.
Restrain's a good word. Restrain's okay
Because the
because
opening words of issue 2 say, something about Darius's first conversation with Death, dot,
mhm,
dot, dot, in more ways than one.
yes, yeah.
And I was like, that was good. Like you get it about once an issue, but he's not hitting you over the head with it. So, I mean, the most notes I have on anything here, obviously, in terms of like content to take with you to chew that, like lasts with you when you put the book down and walk away for 6 months, is everything in issue 5.
Yeah,
But
the wrap up. Yeah,
right, but it's like the wrap up, but there's also like these beautiful poems woven in, and
yeah.
all of this stuff.
Which is an interesting break. So is an interjection. It was interesting to reread Laila Starr after having read Rare Flavors. Again, that's Ram V and Filipe Andrade's follow up. Rare Flavors is intercut. That's a book about food, about Indian food, and a celebration of food and what food means. Those pages throughout the entire story are interrupted with recipes and cooking directions for the various foods that they're talking about. So he has these interstitials, and they feel and they're presented exactly like those poems are in issue 5. So it was interesting to go back and see kind of like a proto version of that, but only see it at the end.
Right.
I feel like that's the kind of thing now that after having done a book like Rare Flavors that had these interstitials that are both a part that are both integrated into the story and also separate from the story. That maybe they would take some of that poetry that they use at the end, and you would see that interspersed throughout the entire series, and that being kind of a motif there. So it was interesting, and it is I don't know about jarring, but it is noticeable that
Yeah,
that's only in the last issue that they play around with that format.
yeah. I mean, to me, it feels like in another world they would have been cut, but it would have been the contents of the letter from the author in the back of the book saying like, here's some famous Indian poems about death that really, got me thinking and inspired the series. Because I think that's what we're getting. Is like, here's the thinking about life and death that has informed my life, and I'm just kind of weave them in to the
Yeah.
tapestry of this issue.
Those specific cultural points that an American audience, a U.S. audience probably don't know. Because I think in general, just through pop culture and all that, like people are familiar with the images of death from
Sure.
from India and from the excuse me from Hindu and all that stuff. So they're familiar with this the idea of, the three-faced God, the six-armed God, things like that. How much detail they know about it, that varies by person. But I think that real basic surface level has penetrated Western culture. You would agree with that, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
I definitely think so.
And so I think that is where he is starting from. He is under the assumption that you are not unfamiliar with the ideas being presented here in terms of the entities, you know? And I think he's relying on the audience having some basic understanding that yes, these other religions have these manifestations, these images of these various gods, and doesn't necessarily hold your hand through it, but I think then starts to step deeper into those specific cultural touch points. And I think you're right about the poetry there, that here is not just what the depictions are that you may have seen through other media and all that, but here are we're drilling down another level kind of thing. That this is the kind of stuff that you get if you grow up in this, not just seeing what makes it across the ocean from a kind of culture exchange standpoint.
Now, I mean, in light of that, and I do want to get into the issues themselves, but do you think this book would be less meaningful to you if you come from that background? Like, did it strike me as so profound because it was set in a foreign context to me, or you think it hits the same or probably even more if you're
that is a good
if
question.
These are cultural touchstones for you?
And I guess the only way I can think about that is when I read any sort of westernized version done by like a Korean author, for a US audience about various tales of like Korean folklore or things like that,
Well, shoot,
And
I mean, I was just thinking back to our conversation on The Good Asian,
yeah.
where once you
yeah.
and Pornsack started talking about
Yeah.
being a second generation,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm just sitting here like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, all this stuff was just flying over my head, and I loved the book,
Yeah.
but there was just stuff I was missing. I wasn't part of the conversation.
And that's what I'm saying. That there is another level here. And so when it does hit like that for me, yes, it can elevate. So, but I guess the question is there a second level for this book? And I guess neither you or I can answer that because we don't have that cultural knowledge, that cultural DNA. But I think the reason a book like this works is because you don't need that. You're given everything you're supposed to take. You're shown it all. And if you're simply open to it and aren't putting, it goes back, we talked about last week, the beginner's mind, right? Possibility versus the expert mind. If you come to this book with the idea that I'm being shown a different world, different belief system, different everything, and you're not coming in with any sort of judgment or any sort of blinders on, you are given everything you need to know in order to, I believe, fully internalize the story that's being told and the meaning that they're getting across. But yeah, I absolutely think that there's a possibility that it hits deeper on maybe on just some of those specific things. If this is the culture you grew up in, I'm sure that level is there. I almost think it can't not be there when you have an author, when you have creators writing from that experience, because they're part of it, and whether they like it or not, that's in their DNA. So when they're telling this story, whatever their intentions are, what they're trying to get across, I don't think you can't help but synthesize that and put it on the page. So I'm sure there is another level there, but for you and I, for which this culture, this belief, everything about it is completely foreign, I think we're still touched by it. We still connect with it in the way that I think that it's intended to connect with an audience.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think I agree. I like, the only thing is, like, if it's one of those things where, like, every parent in India tells their kids, like, well, we'll all die, and that's what makes life valuable. So, like, if that's a common
Sure,
tale,
yeah.
if that's like the base cultural agreement on, like, this is how we talk about death, then I think but I don't think it's really that different than what
Well,
like deeper Western minds would say.
but I think it comes in the specificity that we see in issue 2 when we are seeing the specific funeral rites that they do, you know,
Yes.
where if you are unfamiliar with it, you don't have to ask why you're doing this, what is happening here. All you have to do is accept that this is what tradition is. This is how they mark the passing of life, and this is what their funerals are, which are very different than what we think of a Western funeral here in kind of U.S. culture. And those rites and observations and all of that are different all over the world. So again, if you simply accept the specifics of what you're being shown, then yeah, you can then get past the details of what's happening and just let the idea of it all wash over. And I think you're right. You find a little more universality in terms of what the meaning behind it, what's being passed down, what's being said about life and death, is just being presented in a way that maybe you don't understand because you've never seen it before. But it doesn't matter that you've never seen it before, because it's simply the act at the end. It's the last thing you do, whether it's what they do in India, whether it's what you do in the States, whether, that however you mark the passing, the funeral of a person is specific to each region, each people, each culture. But again, those themes I think are universal of what life and death mean. And that's what they show here.
Yeah. All right. Shall we jump into issue 1? I mean, we
Sure.
don't need to go through like issue by issue, beat by beat.
But I mean, but in this weird way, because as we mentioned, because of the setup in terms of how,
right. I mean, it's a very chronological story.
Are we going to are we going to call her Death? We're not going to call her Layla. We'll call her Death, right?
I'm fine with either.
Okay, all right. Because
because
there's
the story
a scene,
calls her both.
Well, there's a scene at the end in 5 when she gives the download, or maybe it's in 4 when she gives a download to Darius, and she's like, I was fired from my job and I came down to live as a mortal, or I was a student who died and a god lived in me. So like even she is she Death who inhabited
Yes, she
Laila
is
Starr,
Death who inhabits Laila Starr.
or is she Laila Starr who had Death inhabit her? So
Right.
there is some
But the name of the book, I think, is it's because you couldn't say the many deaths of death.
Yeah. But there is a play on words there, right? The many deaths, like
Right.
not deaths as a verb, but deaths as like a proper noun.
Yeah.
Many deaths of so okay, we'll go with death. But anyway, you're right. It's very specifically chronological because it's all about Death's meetings with Darius, and as you said, at those moments when he has experienced loss and death. So yeah, there is a natural progression through the issues that also kind of maybe dictates what our discussion is, even though we don't typically go in that round, issue to issue. It might be a little more fitting here.
Yeah. So there's wording in issue 1 that kind of unlocked possibly a new angle for me, which I'm going to bounce off you.
Okay.
But first of all, very first page, you get a gorgeous splash page from Filipe, which I think sets the mood, the color palette, everything for the book. It's also just gorgeous to look at.
I'm going to assume that actually is like how Mumbai is laid out too. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm going to assume.
I did not fact check that, but I would also assume
Yeah.
that he's working from either memory or a picture.
Yeah. And real quick, before we move into the actual content of the story, I want to call the colorist Inez Amaro. Mentioned them before last week when we talked about Felipe's story in Swan Songs, which was a book, which was, that issue he drew and colored himself. And I talked about how when he colors himself, to me, it looks like a color pencil. Looks like he's coloring as like he's drawing color at the same time. That he's not doing the lines and inks and then it's being colored after the fact, which I think is very different. I think you can see very clearly here that this is maybe a little more traditional in terms of black and whites being sent off to a colorist and the colorist working. There's a little more there's a smoothness and a little more flatness to the color, which is more like we see in kind of the mass publication of comics. But the thing that does jump out is the high contrast in colors, right? The really warm kind of pinks and reds and yellows and oranges and all that, and the very cool blues and teals and all that. There's a very sharp contrast that really comes across in a lot of Andrade's work that I'm assuming that it's something that they've talked about. You see it here in this book. You see it in Rare Flavors. You see it in the issue of Swan Songs that he did. That there's a deep contrast there. That's very, I think it's very inviting. I love it. And it's very sharp and distinct without having to be kind of like big bright colors, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree with everything you said.
Yeah.
It's a gorgeous book, and it's
Yeah.
the same team, exact same colorist for Rare Flavors, right?
Did he do Rare Flavors on his own? No,
okay.
you know what, Vamp a little. I want to check that. Go into what you were going to say about.
Yeah, well, before I get there, just want to give a shout out to the comedy. Like, you don't expect comedy from a book called The Many Deaths of Laila Starr, but I think he very wisely starts out with this lightheaded parody of deaths being fired. And giving the brochure of a mortal world of possibilities, and it's like it's department restructuring. Just getting laid off, and the way the boss like spins and is looking out the window and says like, "How many years have you been with us now?" Like
feels
since
like an
eternity.
eternity.
Yeah,
I was going to say that.
Yeah.
I love that panel. It's like,
it's so good.
I've literally been here for an eternity. Yeah. Real quick. Andrade colored himself on Rare Flavors too,
Oh, he
which
did?
is why
Okay.
I think it looks a little more similar to the issue of Swan Songs that he did. But I will say that this, while I love anytime we go back to the gods and the office building and all that stuff, it does feel like a different kind of book because we cut back to it a little bit, a couple times later in the series. It does. I don't want to say it feels out of place, but I can see how it's a little jarring because we go from, you're right, this like weird office comedy into the actual story, and every time we cut back to it, it's very strange. But I love it. I think it is hysterical. Just the banality of it.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Yeah. It's. I think it's. You're right, and it's kind of audacious to start the story that way. Like the story proper that way, we're introduced to death as she's being fired. And basically the next time we see her, she is now inhabiting Laila Starr. And throughout though, but we get this, like, we don't get the story of Laila Starr, which is interesting because obviously like,
Yeah, she doesn't matter.
but we see her at the party there. We see her jump from the window, so this is a young woman who has decided to die. And is, say, I don't know what the phrase would be, but yeah, like, so we don't get anything about her and like what was her life leading up to that, to that moment there. But so yeah, so you have this kind of tragic setup, juxtaposed again with this incredibly normal office politics stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's what he does so well. Is he's gonna give you something kind of heavy and kind of serious. But he's entertaining too. Like, this is not a chore to read. In fact, I think it's a delight to read. I think like this book is very easy to knock out in one sitting. I know almost every book is that way for you, but for people who like me will often, grab a trade like this and read one issue before bed. That's not an option with this book for me. Like, this is I'm going to be here all night. or I'm going to be here as long as this takes
until I'm done. Yeah, sure.
But what struck me this time was, when Death is in the elevator on the way down and finds out where Darius is located, it says Death made her final bargain. Now, that could be talking about what Death's business is in general, but it just triggered something for me, and I thought, oh my gosh, is this whole series about Death going through the stages of grief? Because when she's first laid off,
interesting.
She's denial, then it's anger, then it's bargaining, and then you go through a long period of depression, and the series ends with an acceptance.
That's good. That's good because they do make it a point after she's fired, kind of presumably as she's cleaning out her desk and all that, all those it's narration. And
Right.
we get, yeah, that she, she
And we
stormed her
don't
way
know who
through. She
that
was
narrator is. Like,
in
you
this
know,
in this issue. No, we don't. Yeah,
right. Which
this is
is
this is
unusual in this series.
yes. This first issue is kind of omniscient, kind of third person there. We don't get that throughout kind of the rest of the story. I think it kind of appears at the end when Death is staying with Darius in his final days. We kind of return to that, but we don't see it much throughout the overall the rest of the series there. But I like that idea of a lot of this series being the bargaining slash depression slash acceptance stages. You know?
Yeah. Um, which I'm not sure the rest of the book really supports that, and
Yeah.
I certainly don't think that's necessarily what they were going for there. But I had, it's been a while. We don't do this often enough, which is a wild thing to say. Great West Wing call out here.
Yeah.
When she goes to kill the baby, and then the ghost says the baby's name, like, oh,
Yeah.
this is Darius, and learning the name
Yeah.
makes it that's the deal breaker for Death. Like,
Yeah.
I can't kill this baby, even if my whole existence depends on it, if I also know the baby's name.
Yeah.
And
Because
why that's the line for Death, is you could debate that, but that's not the type of book this is. But it reminded me a lot of Take the Sabbath Day, where CJ was talking about how she's totally indifferent toward the death penalty. She's like, I know I should care, yada yada yada. But later I have to get on and read that his mother's name was something something something,
Yeah.
and she's like, I don't know why, but like knowing that the guy who's a murderer who just got sentenced to death and then died, knowing he has a mother and she has a name, changes everything.
Yeah.
And I was like, it is very interesting. It's like what's the old quote about how, like, 1,000 people dying is a statistic, and 3 people dying or whatever when they have names,
It's a tragedy. Yeah.
it's a tragedy. Yes, that's
Yeah,
see.
yeah,
I knew you could finish that sentence.
Yeah. But no, yeah, there's a psychological component there of when Death is holding the baby, it's an idea, it represents something. When she knows the baby's name is Darius, the baby becomes Darius, it transcends that now. And so, yeah, there is a psychological component there that, but I think part of that is showing for Death that now she is living essentially a mortal life now. So she is now experiencing things as a person would, when before I don't think that would have bothered her.
Right.
It wouldn't have mattered before because she had a job to do and that's what she did. But now that she is a mortal with but still has kind of the mindset of a god, she's having to try to reconcile those things. And for the first time, those wires get crossed, and now she all of a sudden can't act because this idea has turned into an actual human being, a person now, just by saying the name.
Yeah. Great first issue. I mean, I know we talk about this a lot. First issue can be very make or break. Fantastic first issue.
Yeah.
Because I think it sets your expectations, especially since you get like the resurrection, resuscitation, whatever it is, from the God of Life in this issue.
Yeah.
It would be one type of ending for her to run out of the hospital, get hit with the 18-wheeler,
Yeah.
and that's the end of the first issue. And you're like, was that a one-issue comic? Like, what are we doing here?
And I think it automatically sets, because of how it ends, it says, 8 years from the day Laila Starr died, parentheses twice. But now, after one issue, you can just automatically know, oh, this is what the book is going to be. It's been 8 years. She's going to go again and she's going to die again. and it's going to be resurrected again. It's so it's like you've been given the format just off of one issue. I think a savvy reader just knows, oh, this is the format now. So now you take that, combine it with what the title is, The Many Deaths of Laila Starr, and you just know what you're going to get, and you know now that you've jumped ahead a significant amount of time, 8 years, right? And so now I think you're in your mind, you're said, okay, well then, so now issue 2 is going to be set probably 8 years after this first one. And then, so you're anticipating, how does she die and how long is the jump going to be? At least for me, when I first read this, it was like, oh, like that's the hook. Now I'm in. Because I think leading into this, you don't know what the title means and how it's going to play into the storytelling. But you get to the end of this first issue, and for me, like it solidified immediately. And
It clicks
now,
like we're gonna see
yeah,
her die.
yeah, yeah,
Wait,
and
we're gonna see her
it's
die. How many issues is this? Yeah, 5 times.
yeah, and it's going to be some length of time, some potentially significant length of time, meaning that the world she comes back to is going to be vastly different every single time, and specifically, Darius is going to be different every single time. And I think obviously that's the key. I will say though, the 2 pages when she is chased out of the hospital and we jump to like first person view
Yeah.
as she's running out the hospital to the point where like you kind of see her hair on the sides of the panels in terms of what she might be seeing as she's running, as she's knocking past people, running, doing all that, something like that. I think it was so fun. I loved jumping into that. God, you mentioned Tom Taylor earlier. I mentioned his Nightwing run. They did a issue which I think maybe won the Eisner for best single issue. It was that or the continuous issue they did Tom Taylor and Bruno Redondo, but they did one from first person view of Nightwing, Dick Grayson, from him like getting a call, getting up, getting suited up, swinging out the window onto a train, and the whole thing was done from this first person perspective. So anytime a comic does something like that, and again
I
plays
can't
with the storytelling
imagine
forming,
an extra challenge for the artist.
oh yeah. But it's
everything's
so cool.
different scale.
Yeah,
And yeah.
but you can it's a way to create motion in stationary comics, right? In sequential art, you can't see things move, but yet just seeing the progression, and seeing the way things are drawn, what the action she sees is happening, whether it's like, a cart flying, action lines, whatever it is, you get a sense of motion. You're propelled forward by the way that the panels are laid out and what's being shown as she's moving. So it's such a great tool. I'm sure it's not easy because you're right. Perspective can be kind of often weird and a little wonky there, but I love when we get things like that in comics. Just a team thinking outside the box and being like, what's another way because there are so many ways you can create the sense of motion as someone is running and being chased. In this case, through doors, down through hallways, downstairs, out in the street, there are tons of ways you can do that really, really effectively. So for them to choose a way that I think is really fun and interesting, it is really cool.
Yeah. Oh, it's next level.
Yeah.
Now, have you read anything into the compilation of like her mode of death being different each time? I was trying to and couldn't really. It's like you get, hit by a truck, crushed by a temple, drowned, burned alive.
Yeah.
And then the initial death was jumping off a building. That's before death inhabited her. But I'm like, I don't know if there's any pattern there other than look how many ways there are to die.
I mean,
which, I think
you could go out and be
point.
like, it's elemental.
Oh, yeah. Earth, wind, water, fire.
Fire. Yeah. I mean that maybe there's something there. I don't know. I did not think about that. I didn't clock anything to that. So,
I think I'm reaching, but
maybe so.
It's one of those books that invites reaching. Like that's what makes it fun to discuss is like, there's so much here and he's not hitting you over the head with points.
Yeah. But I think And that I do think is true in terms of what their intention is, in terms of what the story they're trying to tell. I think instead what's maybe a little more overt and on the page is Death slash Layla's view towards dying each time. You know, how initially running out of the car, came out of nowhere, no way to think about it, wakes up, oh crap, I died. Then when she's drowned, there is still a sense of fear, like, oh my God, what's happening? And then that great moment when the crow picks her up and she's like, oh, great, you're still here, a friend. And she's like, dude, I'm a funeral crow. Like, I show, And
Right.
so again, the realization of like, oh, I died. To then I think the party is next, right? She's burned the cigarette, which
Yeah.
is there at that point. There is like she doesn't care anymore. Like she fell asleep with a lit cigarette and it was like, oh, well, whatever. The temple, like that was an active thing. The temple spoke to her, was like, can you leave the doors open? She kind of knew and accepted at that point. So I think that is much more overt and like I said, on the page in terms of what her thought process is in terms of approaching and thinking about dying. But the mode of death, and that is interesting. I wonder if there was something there, if there's some level of intention, whether it was to having connected or if they're trying to say anything about the way those deaths can affect someone. I don't know. That's interesting.
Yeah. I don't want to make, too much out of any one of the particular deaths
Yeah,
because
sure.
they were kind of just like, and now we transition to,
Yes, yeah.
the next period.
Well,
And the
her
intervals, do you think are strategically selected by death, or is it just, or by life, or the god of life, or is it just kind of when he gets around to it?
he does seem to imply that like every time it happens, it's harder and harder, which explains
8 years, 12 years, 28
yeah,
years. Yeah.
yeah, which explains why the gaps get longer and longer there. The story reason for that obviously is that Darius needs to age and experience different parts of life.
Right.
So yeah, that's the obvious answer there. But yeah, their life does make a point of saying, yeah, like you can't keep doing this because like it's taking longer and longer, hence why those gaps get longer. But yeah, I mean, it's just, on some level, you're right. The deaths are just like she's had an interaction with Darius. She's said, done, imparted whatever she needs to at that moment. Thus, now she has to die. So she can then be resurrected by life and do it all again with a different version of Darius.
Yeah. And for interacting so much with him, really doesn't end up putting her thumb on the scale that much. She's really just an
Yeah.
observer.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not until after his wife dies, which I think is
That's issue 4.
issue 4. Yeah. That
Well,
he's like, look, I know you, like, you keep popping up.
yeah.
And then, it says, who are you? She's like, well,
Yeah.
long story,
Well,
but I'm deaf. And he's like, of course you are.
yeah. I think it's important though. Like she doesn't interact him with in issue 2 because he's like an 8-year-old kid. She's like, oh, I can't do that, And
I
then,
thought she talked to him.
well, no, she does. She talks to him, but like she can't go through with the plan.
Oh,
Quote unquote,
right.
Yeah, but her interaction, she's not in that moment. It's not like she's speaking to Darius, the person that she feels eventually ruins her life because she gets her. He's responsible for her getting fired. She's talking to a kid. And then later at the party, she doesn't know she's talking to Darius.
Okay.
That's
And that makes a huge difference. Yeah.
yeah, and that was kind of the revelation from life after the fact when she was basically like I think he's like, that was you were talking to, and she's like, what? No, oh God. Of course, Darius clocks that it's the same person, because then you're right. Then in issue 4, when that's after his wife has died, when she seeks him out specifically, and again, just so happens to coincide the day that his wife has died, because that's when she shows up. She shows up on days of death. Then at that point, then he clocks like, you were the girl on the beach, you were the girl at the party. Like, who are you? Explain what's going on. And then there's kind of all cards on the table there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's. Let's see. What do I have? Yes. So I think jumping back, I think we're still only technically in issue 2.
Yeah.
Chronologically, but I think it's interesting that you could see a little bit more of Darius to the point where we now know him better than Layla does.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
get to see his relationship with Bardem. Is that how we
yeah.
say his name?
The
Bardhan?
laborer, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Layla, not great at swimming.
Yeah.
But also, I love that line where she's starting to like feel a real empathy for the dead. She kind of wrestles
Hmm.
with the weight of all of the pain that her existence and work has
Hmm.
caused people. And then it says, or perhaps it was just a riptide.
Yeah.
Maybe it's all in her head. But it's one of those like King's Cross Station moments where it's like, well, who cares if it's all in your head?
Yeah.
It's really impacting you this
Yeah.
way, and it really
Doesn't mean it's
doesn't
not
matter.
real.
Well, and it
Yeah.
doesn't matter whether it's happening or not. If you're getting the lesson of
Hmm.
it, if you're being shaped by it, then it doesn't. It's real in the way that counts.
Yeah.
So yeah, she drowns. 12 years go by, which I would say. I hate that I'm always the one doing this. I would say issue 2 was probably my least favorite single issue in the series in the small collection here, and I think it felt like a really good ordinary issue after a very action packed issue 1. But in hindsight, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Nothing I would change.
I'm going to say, could that also be a little retroactive because issue 3 is like really out there, and issue 3 is kind of really amazing. Issue
Well, I
3,
think that's the other thing is
yeah,
like,
that's what I'm wondering because issue 3, it may be my favorite one because it is, it is so different.
oh, it's a big swing. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
and I think that's what I mentioned last week in our anthology week. I was
Mhm.
like, anthologies were like oohing and ahhing at like all the different artistic expression and how they're all standalone stories. And here Ram manages to do that in a like continuous story.
Mhm.
It's like we're going to switch POV for one issue, still move the play. It's very much like what Dan Harmon was able to do on Community when they would do like the big paintball episodes or something. They would lean 100% into a style like it's a Western, it's a Star Wars thing, it's this, it's this, it's this, but like the characters are still moving forward. They're still finishing their classes and their semesters, and they still have life decisions, but it's all happening in the context of this different story medium. And I think that takes just so much more effort to do it right and to do it well. And even the lettering box, which I'm sure you clocked on issue
Oh
3,
yeah, yeah,
they're all
yeah. I would
puffs
say
of smoke.
yeah. We'll call out Ann World Design as the letterer who does some really really cool stuff here. But yeah, the idea of having this issue narrated by a lit cigarette. Interesting. Also, the idea of like the cigarette clocking its life beginning when it's lit, basically. So the idea that
Yeah.
like once it starts, it can't stop until you reach the end. And that is kind of Layla's thesis at the end there, right? Death's thesis of like life's like a cigarette, it's meant to be smoked. The idea that life is meant to be lived, that this has an intent and purpose. It's meant to be used, meant to be experienced.
Well, and there's also that line. It's not exactly worded like this, but something about how each drag is better because it's finite and you're getting closer to the last.
Yeah.
And so you have to savor each. The last few hits are the ones you really have to savor
Yeah.
because when it's gone, it's gone. And so the cigarette is not only the narrator; it's also the metaphor for
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
Um,
Which is a
and
wild metaphor for life.
and it's the plot device
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
setting the building on fire and
Yes.
killing Layla. It's just like
Yeah.
everything. He just every box is checked.
No, and it's, I
issue.
think, which is why I think this is my favorite of the issues because there is so much synergy there. And there's also, I think, the idea too, kind of a next level, that she shares the cigarette with him, So life, our metaphor isn't just a solitary thing. It's something that is shared and can be communal. That you can choose to hand it to someone else and to experience it with someone else. And that's all part of the experience of living, which in this case is just smoking. Again, which is a wild
Right.
metaphor to use for life, but the way it's layered totally works. Totally works.
Yeah, they definitely should have had like a Marlboro variant of this, or like a Camel
The Joe
variant.
Camel, yeah,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
Joe
the
Camel
Joe Camel
variant, yeah,
variant
yeah,
of this issue.
yeah.
Definitely left a lot of money on the table there, Romfy. Just I think the amount of money you would have gotten from Big Tobacco for
Mhm.
one variant versus what you made on the rest of the series. Yeah, but probably best not to take their money. So
Yeah, yeah, probably not. But
uh, we'll call it a
um,
wash.
yeah, but I think just the innovation there to use the cigarette as a metaphor for life, and not just for life, but for living. How you experience life is yeah, it's so cool. And I said I really do love this issue, and so that's what I was saying. Maybe this following issue two, in some way, diminishes issue two through no fault of its own.
I think that's definitely true. I mean, I
Okay.
think issue one just kicking down the door, like a new tone, new style
Mhm.
storytelling, just great stuff all the way through. Um, issue two being a normal, nothing wrong with it, normal, and then issue three, um, probably cracking my list of like top 20 favorite issues of all time. Just in terms of, and it's like the things that make my list are not like, oh, it was the best story or it had the most pithy wisdom or even like the best art, or it's just like when you came up with an off the wall idea and you made it work, not in an anthology but in an ongoing series. And so, here it would be this one in the unwritten. It's the Choose Your Own
Choose Your Own
Adventure
Adventure, yeah.
Lizzie story. Those are the ones that I always just like. I think my list of favorite issues is the list that I want to give people to like shock them as to what comics can be.
Well, yeah, there
It's
is
like if you
yeah,
think it's like reading Superman panels from the 50s and I give you an issue told from the point of view of a cigarette that's a metaphor for life,
yeah.
I think it's just going to knock your socks off.
And you're right, it does work so well in the context of the entire story, especially that knowing what our setup is from our first two issues, knowing what Death has gone through in her time as Layla,
Right.
knowing what she's gone through and why she's there, and how at this point she is just basically zoned out at a party, right?
Right.
She is no longer actively looking for Daria. She's abandoned that quest for the time being. Again, doesn't even know that kid is Darius. It's only afterwards when life tells her that. There's that great moment when after he brings her back, they're kind of sitting on that wall by the sea there, and he specifically says, real hammer on the head there when he says, like, I'm nothing without you, meaning that life is meaningless without death, which is kind of the idea of the entire book, right? Because we should say, we didn't mention it up top here, but the reason Death gets fired is because Darius grows up to invent immortality.
Right.
So that is kind of that's the narrative push, which isn't like super important to the story that's being told here, the meaning of it, but that is the narrative push as to why Death gets fired and her department gets reorganized and all that. Because if humans aren't dying anymore, then we don't need a goddess of death. So this idea that death is important because it has to give life meaning there, but in that whole bit there, that conversation, that's when life tells her, like, no, that who that kid, like the key to the party was Darius, and that's when he hands her kind of like, this is where he is now. I've been keeping tabs on him, which she hadn't been doing anymore. She had moved past that crusade of hers to like get her job back. So she's just
Right.
she just completely zoned out. And so again, you can then take this kind of narrative swing and have it work perfectly for the character, where the character is. It moves everything forward. You get so much more about Darius and understanding more about his life and kind of where he comes from and where he came from, where he is now, and just even just by parachuting in on these specific moments in his life, we get so much of who he is and understanding of who his character is and his relationship to death, lowercase d death.
Right.
You know, we understand what his relationship is to that. And so as it builds, and then I think especially as we get to the next issue, when now he is married, has a young son, and his wife has died, and has this inner counter now with the personification of the goddess of death, and what that leads him to do, which is then create immortality.
Right.
Like that death, that, the idea that death causes the thing that is ultimately her, quote unquote, her downfall.
Well, that's the interesting
her interaction with Darius, because in this case, she specifically seeks him out to sit down and talk to him about what she was trying to do,
Right.
and all that.
But that's the interesting thing about the kind of Ghost of Christmas Future forthtelling in this book, because at the beginning, it's a foregone, predestined conclusion. He will invent a cure for death. Yep. And then there's the argument to say, well, had they not fired her and put her in Layla's body and sent her down to Earth, she might not have had all these encounters with him. He may not have invented,
Exactly.
She was the causal agent. But then he ends up technically fulfilling the prophecy, quote unquote, by coming up with the invention, but then not deploying it.
Yeah.
And that's
almost
also
because of his interactions with death as well.
Right. So what struck me about that quote from Prana, who's the god of life, the I am nothing without you. Obviously, I wrote that down too. Huge thesis statement there. What struck me there is that I think a lot of other books would have told this story in the other direction. I think if there were a god of life, that would typically be seen as the naive character who's like, we don't need death. I'm going to go down to Earth and live among people. And, god of death is frequently the more sagely restrained one.
The pragmatic one.
The pragmatic one.
Yeah.
Who ends up teaching life that, like, no, you need me. But here, death is the naive one, just going about her business, doing her job, never questioned it. And life is the one with some introspection, some hindsight, but not just introspection. Like, sees and appreciates his own role because he sees and appreciates other people's roles. And I think, that's also a pretty big distinction. So I think, maybe not, but I think there's a lot of, like, if it were a Disney movie, I think it would have been told the other way around. If it were, a Thor comic, it would have been told the other way around, where, like, the good guy is the naive one who needs to go learn, and then you learn something good about bad old death, who ends up teaching you something valuable about life. So anyway, I kind of appreciated what I perceived as a reversal. Maybe it's not, maybe that's not intended, but again, it's just a book that invites you to, like, squint and turn your head and, like, chew on it a little bit, and not chew on it in, like, a depressing way or a frustrating way. It's just fun. It's like, it's a fun idea to mess around with.
Yeah. Interesting talking about death being as the pragmatic one. Obviously, this is an audio medium. You can't see me, but Mike can. And behind my shoulder here is death of the Endless from Sandman, which is another personification of this idea of death. And in Sandman, death, besides being, like, the best character, is the one who is very pragmatic. But at the same time, she understands and cherishes life because she understands that it dies. And the understanding that she imparts to people, as they are, she's there when they die, and she's there to ferry them across to whatever comes next. But she's speaking to them about the life that they lived and things of that nature. And there is a sense that death is like that because death is inevitable, right? It comes from that
Right.
No matter what you do, no matter how long or how short you live, death comes for us all. And so she doesn't see it in Sandman. She doesn't see it as necessarily a sad or sorrowful thing. It's like this is what comes next. And there's so much in Sandman about that. The kind of the two famous quotes about death is one of the guys, a guy dies, and he's like, he's scared. It's like, what happens? What comes next? And death is like, just says very reassuring, like, this is when you find out. This is what comes next. And the one that really stands out, the death quote, is a guy who has lived for like 1,500 years. He's made it all the way through, doing various things and whatnot, and he dies when a random wall collapses on him. He's just walking the street in New York City. It's kind of ridiculous there. And when death shows up, he looks at it. He's like, I did good, right? Like 1,500 years. Like that's a good amount of time, right? I lived a good life. I did pretty good. And death turns to him and just says, you got what everybody gets, Bernie. You got a lifetime,
Yeah.
And so, and that idea that doesn't matter how long or short it is, it comes for us all. And she has a very pragmatic view that this is my job. Someone has to be here to do this. But it doesn't mean I can't do it without empathy, without feeling, without knowing. And there are some death miniseries where, like, once a year death lives as a mortal to help remind her of what life is like in the Sandman universe. But she is that embodiment of this is my job, I got to do it, but also that empathy of, I understand what this means for you as a mortal. And this is the journey that Layla is on, that this death is on, that she is trying to, in some way, she's getting through her interactions with Darius and her interactions with is it Prada? Well, I'm sorry,
Prana,
Prada.
Prana.
Prana. Yeah. So she is getting that level too, even though she is no longer the god of death. She's not the personification of that. She's living in this body, but she's still getting this understanding and this lesson of what her job was and how it affected people and what it means to be affected by that. And I think that's the arc that she is on throughout the story.
Yeah. By the way, one other Sandman shout out, and this is in reference to the Netflix adaptation, but that whole issue with the crow, I just heard in Patton Oswalt's voice.
Yes. Yeah.
Such an odd choice in the show. I mean, I get it because Patton's like a huge comic guy.
Yeah.
A huge Sandman guy. He wanted in. But I found it very striking.
Yeah. But he was perfect as Matthew the Raven. I mean, that's perfect. So
yeah, it was really good.
Yeah. But yeah, no, there is but yeah, it's again, so try to clock in terms of what our characters are going through here. What can death learn about life and all that? This is her kind of taking those steps now. And I think I talked about earlier in this episode about her relationship to dying changes and evolves as we goes. And when we get to issue 4 here, this is her like truly accepting it. Again, because she is speaking with the temple is talking to her. She's having a conversation with the building. And at the end of this issue, there is just an acceptance of it was this temple's time to die because the caretaker had died. And she willingly stays there, opens the doors to be there when it happens. Right. Like, again, more tracking because I think part of that too is her interaction here with Darius is the most fraught.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what all to say about issue 5 because it feels like gilding a lily to really talk about it too much here. I do love that she almost gets hit by an 18-wheeler again.
Yeah.
Would have been a very different end to the series.
This is the download because this is them coming face to face. This is the confrontation of him finding out, and then resolution is in 5 where when now he is at death's door. But here on this terrible day after his wife has died, and now once again seeing this woman who he now has kind of connected the dots of, oh, I saw you here when this person died. I saw you here when this person died, and now you're back again. And he's like, how dare you? Because in his mind now, she's showing up almost like taunting him on the days of these deaths, now that he's putting the pieces together. When, of course, that is not her intention at this point. Her intention there is basically to like apologize for being part of his life. But yet it becomes so fraught, it becomes so kind of tension filled because it's happening on like this day of all days for him.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, issue four was fantastic, and I like that. Darius, however we're gonna say his name.
Yeah. It's probably actually it is probably Darius, but
I think it is too.
yeah.
I am realizing that in real time.
As soon as you said it, I realized that's probably what it is.
Yeah. But I like the kind of character he is. Again, Ramvi has surprised me when you hear that there's a character who finds the cure for death. You expect them to be like the insufferably plucky optimist, not like an ordinary guy who's gone through a lot of hard stuff in life.
And his motivation here is anger. It's like
Right,
revenge on
he's gonna
death.
cure death out of spite.
Exactly, out of spite. Yeah, you're right. It isn't because you're right. He's not this like, oh, I want people to live forever because I want to unburden people from all. No. He's basically like, you showed up here again on the day that my wife died, and again, he's reading intention into this. That he feels like he's being mocked by death, even though that we know that's not death's intention here. But because of that, he's like, yeah. I now have a mission now to get rid of you. It is my goal in life to do the thing so you don't do this to anybody else. It's out of anger. It's from I was going to say, like, it's not from like a pure place that we think about immortality being this idea of, oh, we're trying to help people and then things go awry. In this case, they've reversed that, right? It comes from a very negative place. And yet once we find out in issue 5, the final issue, once he's done it, he then arrives back at a more pure place, a more calm, settled mindset. Like he goes in the other direction versus having good intentions be perverted into something terrible. He starts from a real negative energy place and ends up at a positive one after he's done it.
Yeah. So what do you make of issue 5? This is the end. You've already kind of commented that it's a little jarring to have the poetry kind of stitched in here.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any sense to you that this ending was a little like forced or rushed? Like,
No,
would you have
no.
preferred they space it out a little bit longer?
No. I didn't. I think from a pacing standpoint, I love this book.
It's a perfect book.
Yeah, in terms of hitting these beats, and when Layla shows up in Darius's life, like at this point, you know these are the key moments, and we've only hit it. They haven't overstayed their welcome in terms of him is even checking up on him without him knowing it.
Right.
That every time there is a direct confrontation, whether again issue 3 is the one where she didn't know that was happening, neither one knew what was happening at that point, but still there's a direct interaction which propels both of them on their character journeys, and it literally only happens 5 times. So no, I feel this ending it wraps up, I think, again, pacing wise, from a storytelling standpoint, the way they impart the story, I think it's perfect. But it is a little weird to have the poems in there, even though I like it. I like what it adds to it. It's only odd because we don't see that anywhere else. If they had sprinkled that stuff in throughout the whole series, I think it would have made a lot more sense, and they probably could have. Like in hindsight, you probably could have done that.
I'm sure once they saw the final product of this issue, they thought, oh, we could have done this all along, which is why Rare Flavors
that's what I'm
looks
saying.
different.
Yeah, in Rare Flavors, they have these interstitials in there that they are a break from the literal storytelling on the page, but they add so much to the overall theme and feel and vibe of the book. So I love seeing that here again. Having then read Rare Flavors, you see kind of that like proto version of it in this one issue here of how they can integrate these non-storytelling bits into the storytelling and make it work.
Yeah. I don't want to like harp on any of the poems or quotes other than I feel like each heartbeat, every breath is rejection of death. Is just a really beautifully written
Hmm.
line. But Darius's conclusion was a bit surprising to me. Someone who's like nursing sick animals, and you know, it's like no one has more utility for the cure for death than Darius,
Hmm.
and yet Darius concludes we don't need it. I'm ready for death, and to like the third brother in the Deathly Hallows, welcomes death like an old friend.
Hmm.
When the time comes, he's already sitting out by the ocean, where they met.
Yeah, yeah.
I guess
As
the
an 8-year-old
the
kid,
the
yeah,
first time,
yeah, really met,
he
yeah.
he had no memory of
Hmm.
being an infant and being held by a crazy lady who'd been dead for 20 minutes, which is I just love how that looked to the hospital.
Yeah,
Also, what's it say about Layla that she jumped out of a building? No one was at the hospital 20 minutes after her death to
yeah,
mourn her, check on her,
yeah,
be with
yeah.
her.
Again,
Presumably, someone that would have been ecstatic about her jumping out of bed, and then sad again about also like strong Thor 1 vibes. I don't know if I mentioned that, like
yeah,
the way he breaks out of the hospital and immediately gets hit by another car.
yeah.
Um,
But no,
it's like a little slapsticky.
it goes back to the idea that Layla as a character is really kind of a non-factor. I don't know if the book would have been. I don't know what it would have added, if it would have added anything, if it would have been a positive or negative, if as part of this journey of seeing where death goes and understanding where Darius goes, if there was some understanding also for what Layla went through in terms of what would bring her. I don't know if that would have been like one bit too many, or if there's maybe something there that there could have been another arc added on and another kind of character journey there. And I said, I don't know if that's something they thought about. It's something they have notes on and have an idea of who this character was. I don't know. I don't know if it would have felt the book would have felt too crowded at that point. But there is kind of when you think about this book and the way that you and I kind of look and break down books, there you do see kind of a hole there in terms of wait, but who is this person that she inhabited? Whose life did she take over? Yes, granted that life had just ended by her own accord, but like what does it mean that this character comes back? Because you're right, there's no one in the hospital. Like there isn't, there's like a small news story of this woman who was dead for 20 minutes came back, but like there's no follow up, you know?
Right. That and yeah, I'm like, if life is so slow about getting around to collecting her,
Yeah,
I don't know what magic he's working with.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
her
yeah.
rotting corpse or pulling it
Yeah.
out of the ground or
But to go back to your initial thought here, I don't think it was strange for Darius. I think because
no, I didn't. I don't think I said strange, but I
okay,
think surprising. I think
okay, all right,
and it's not surprising within the context of this book,
mm-hmm.
but if you pitch a 5-issue comic series to anyone else about the person who invents a cure to death and it ends with him throwing it into the ocean, I think most people are like, well, that's not how I thought that would go. In this
Yeah, yeah.
book, it's like, how else could it have ended?
Yeah, I think by the time we get there and we see again, because we're jumping from the moment of rage when Layla leaves him at the end of issue 4 into this significantly older man who is helping injured animals at the end of his life. And we don't need to connect those. We see a little bit there this idea of, yeah, he invented immortality. He did it. But then like took a breath and took a walk and experienced life and did things kind of like with the mindset of like, oh, I know I can't die now. So I'm going to live life. I'm going to eat all the food I'm not supposed to eat. I'm going to do all the things I wouldn't have done. And has this revelation of like, wow, how fulfilling that was and how meaningful it was to do those things. And how much more they mean if the only chance that we get, that like there's no joy in doing this if you can do it forever. And so he said it makes perfect character arc sense, kind of where he ends up, even given all the death he's experienced, because I think we're getting that thesis back again of what this book is about, what it's trying to impart. The idea that just living life. I think it's the final narration box, right? Perhaps it's enough to remember at story's end the miracle that it was simply to have lived. So
Yeah.
just the idea of existing is what's important. And it's not that it ends, because of course it's going to end. So it's the manner in which you life, what you choose to do with that. And the fact that it comes in the end, again, that makes everything that comes before it meaningful. And that's a very kind of intro philosophy understanding of what death and life are. But I think the way it's presented here, the way it's shown through the journeys, the arcs of both these characters, of both Death slash Layla and Darius, the way they both come to that understanding by the end, I think is really beautiful and really well done.
Yeah. Just an incredible book. And it's like one of the rare books where I read, the 5-issue version, and I'm not trying to think of like, oh, I wonder if someone adapted this for TV or film, or I wonder if they came up and did a follow-up series, or if they did another series in the same universe. I'm like, I don't want any of that. Like, it's perfect. It's just perfect the way it is.
Well, this book's come to an end, and you're not like, gee, what happens next? You get to the end, and there is a real satisfying, like you've gone on a journey, you've gone on a trip with these characters, and said you get to a real, I think, real satisfying conclusion and understanding where the characters and the readers and the creators, everything comes to a meeting of the minds. Everyone comes to the same place, and I think that's a rare thing where they've
The
brought
happy ending is Death gets her job back.
well,
A good economy for Death.
yeah. But yeah, there's no need for more though. I mean, and yet like this seems like a pretty easy movie adaptation. You could do it real simply since it's just like five
Yeah, I mean,
vignettes.
it'd be gorgeous, but
Yeah.
it's just
Yeah.
like,
It's unnecessary.
what could you ever do on film
Yeah.
to convey that the middle fifth of the story is told from
Yeah.
the perspective of a cigarette?
Yeah.
It's just like
you wouldn't.
if it was a 5-issue or 5-episode prestige TV series, you could do one whole episode told from the cigarette, and people would lose their minds. Like the critics would just be raving about it.
Yeah.
And I feel like I just stumbled across this book. Like, it is an Eisner nominated book, but it does not get nearly the attention I think it deserves.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think it was. I don't know if maybe it's a subject matter thing. I can see an argument. People are like, yeah, it's probably too Indian, But it's like, again,
Yeah.
we talk about that central theme from
Well,
Swan
that in a
songs.
book about death dropping in 2021.
Yeah.
Like, too soon, man.
There is there's some timing, but the idea is a book you've been working on for a while there. It didn't just show up when the book gets solicited. You've been going at this for a while here. But again, this idea of keeping your mind open to possibility and understanding that like the universality of the story, the understanding comes from the specificity. It's just set in a particular time and place in the world with certain beliefs and certain understandings and certain way of viewing the world. And through that lens, everyone can connect to it. There's a universality to it, to the understanding and the viewpoint that is told because it's presented to you in a way that maybe you're unfamiliar with. But that doesn't matter because the themes are universal and the storytelling is so good.
Right.
That it doesn't matter that you don't know the specifics of what's going on, that maybe you don't understand the specific politics, relationships of the people and everything that's happening there. None of that actually matters. I'm sure it hits more. We talked if it's more if this is what you grew up with, if this is a deeper understanding for you, but it's not critical to understanding the story because everything you need to know is right there. You still feel the things you're supposed to feel. You still think the things you're supposed to think. And I think that's why this book is so successful.
Yeah. Gorgeous, gorgeous book. Beautifully written, beautifully drawn, beautifully colored.
Yeah.
Beautifully lettered.
Yeah.
Just shout out to the entire creative team.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fantastic, fantastic book. And I'm really glad we did this in Death Month. I think it's a really good follow-up for Swan Songs and like a new angle on it. And next week we take another entirely different angle on Death.
Yeah. A completely different perspective. Not one from a cigarette. But yeah, next week, we'll be talking about I Kill Giants. Joe Kelly, J.M. Ken Niamura from Image Comics. That'll be a totally different look at the idea of death and dealing with death from a totally different perspective, which I think will be a fun juxtaposition to what we just talked about when we're dealing with the goddess of death, the person effectively responsible for death, coming to an understanding of what life is, versus what we get in I Kill Giants, which is essentially that of a child. We basically
It's basically like if issue 2 of this series were
the whole
thing.
book. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we're staying in that mindset and trying to grapple with that through the eyes of a child, kind of the things we think that children maybe aren't ready for. It's one of those adult things that maybe you try to shield or hide or protect your child from. But you don't want them exposed to that, because it's too adult, it's too heavy. And what does that do, and how is that presented? So no, I think it's going to be great to jump into I Kill Giants next week. I know after starting with Swan Songs and going to Laila Starr here, I kind of like the flow we're in right now.
Yeah, very exciting stuff. So pick up I Kill Giants, read it, and join us next Thursday as we continue Death Month. And then we will be concluding, just in case you're planning ahead on Hoopla, we'll be concluding with, oh my goodness.
With Day Tripper.
Day Tripper. My gosh.
Yeah. Fabi Moon.
The whole
Gabriel
impetus
Baja.
behind this month was Day Tripper. Yeah. So I doubt there will be a queue for that on Hoopla, but you never know. It's a deceptively popular book.
It's an evergreen all-time seller. So,
and I think it's probably like your library has 1 or 2 copies. So,
And I think, I Kill Giants has had multiple printings. It's been out for over 15 years now.
That one you can find.
Yeah. And I think a book like Laila Starr, when we just finished talking about, can be that kind of evergreen book, that has, I think it has potential in my mind for be a book like Day Tripper, a book that you can give to someone, the whole thing, who hasn't read comics, and be like, this is the kind of thing comics can do. This is the kind of book, this is the kind of story, these are the kind of ideas you can explore and think about. Because I think Day Tripper has been that book for me, for a lot of people, for as long as it's been out. And I think Laila Starr can be that kind of book it's half the size too. It's only 5 issues versus 10 a Day Tripper. So it's a much quicker, easier read. It can be that kind of book that can be evergreen like that. And I think these stories that explore this idea of death and life and the meaning, those are ones that have a lot of fodder for being that kind of evergreen book. So it's been fun to talk about this one here this week with you.
And I'll just say one more crossover crowd. I think I Kill Giants is probably the easiest sell we will ever make to a manga reader.
Oh, well, yes. Yeah. It is intentionally drawn. We'll talk about more next week. It is drawn in a manga style, even though it is not done from a specifically Japanese creators. But its full intent was to.
But if you had to flip right to left, it would feel very manga.
Yes.
Yep. So anyway, grab a copy of I Kill Giants, and we'll see you next week.
Peace.